I want to share with you today one of the most important things that I wish people knew about eating carbohydrates. Now, I see a lot of people in the hospital and in clinic who have suffered what we call an ischemic stroke, meaning a blockage of an artery in the brain. Sometimes they've also had a heart attack, a blocked artery in the heart. They can have disease of other arteries, peripheral arterial disease. There's a lot of ways that you can have diseased blood vessels. But one of the things that I wish we spent more time talking about, one of the things that I try to talk about as much as I can, but frankly there just isn't enough time usually, is how they can help improve their diet following something like a stroke or a heart attack or other blood vessel disease. And so I wanted to share with you what I think is the most important piece of information, at least when it comes to how to eat carbohydrates as safely and effectively as possible. How do you eat healthy carbohydrates? Because I think there's a lot of confusion out there about, well, should I eat carbs? And if I should, what does that really mean? What should I be eating? How do I know what's a healthy carbohydrate? And how do I know when it's something I really shouldn't be eating? So that's what I wanted to share today, and I hope that this will help some of you directly, or it might be something that you could share with people who either have risk factors for strokes or heart attacks, or who have already suffered from something like this and are looking for ways to make themselves healthier. And so the most important fact that you need to know about carbohydrates, specifically in terms of whether they're considered healthy for you or unhealthy, is the rate at which they cause sugar to be absorbed from the intestines into the bloodstream. So I'll say that again. The rate at which sugar is absorbed from your food into your bloodstream is, I believe, the most important factor that determines why any particular carbohydrate would be considered healthy versus unhealthy. Now, it's really, really important to understand why that's the case. I mean, anybody can say, well, that's important, but there's a lot of reasons why that matters so much and why I'm saying this is the most important thing. The first of which is really has to do with what happens to the carbohydrates when they're absorbed. And there's only three things you can really do with them once they get absorbed from your intestines into the bloodstream. So either they can be used for immediate fuel. So especially if you're actively exercising, like if you're running a marathon, then you're using a lot of energy immediately. And, in that sense, the more glucose or other sugars that get into your blood, the more it's really fueling your activity right then. The more you're just going to use them up pretty much right away. So in that sense, great, no problem there. If you're exercising, then having extra carbohydrates or something that you're going to burn very quickly. But if they're not utilized right away, if they're not burned and consumed based on active demands, then they need to be stored somewhere. And there's two ways that carbohydrates get stored. The first is by being converted into something called glycogen. Now, glycogen is basically animal starch. And it's very similar to the starch in plants that's called amylopectin. Again, see the other video if you have questions about what that is. But essentially it's long chains of glucose molecules that have branches to it. So it's basically an efficient way to pack together a whole bunch of glucose molecules. It just has more branching than the starch in plants. And so we store glycogen in both the liver and the muscle cells. Those are really the main places. There might be some tiny little scattered pockets of glycogen in other places, but that's pretty much it. And we don't actually store all that much of it, to be honest. Estimates are that the total amount of glycogen that's present in your whole body, so all your what are called skeletal muscles, the main muscles that we use for movement, and in the liver, the total number of glycogen is somewhere up to about 500 grams, maybe a little bit less, possibly a little bit more. But if you might have heard that in a gram of carbohydrates, there's 4 calories, or really kilocalories, present there of energy. So that's basically the equivalent of about 2,000 calories total of glycogen. And when it comes to the liver, that's significantly less than that. It's more like 100 grams of carbohydrates-ish which equates to about 400 total calories of storage in the liver. And so as a fun fact, it turns out that for every gram of glycogen that you store, whether it's in your muscles or in your liver, there's about 3 additional grams of water that are bound up in it. So if you have a total of 500 grams or half a kilogram of glycogen, then it has with it bound up another 1,500 grams or 1.5 kilograms of water with it, for a total of about 2 kilograms, which is a little more than 4 pounds in total weight if your supplies of glycogen are topped up in full. So this is one of the reasons why, if you are normally pretty sedentary, you don't get a lot of exercise, but then you do start exercising pretty significantly, your body uses that glycogen pretty readily, especially for muscle fuel if you're doing at all moderate or high intensity exercise. So it burns that glycogen pretty quickly. And so you might see a pretty quick initial weight loss because you have 4 pounds sitting around waiting to be burned up, both from the glycogen and the water stored with it. So you can see a pretty quick weight loss if you start exercising. The problem is that your body really does prioritize replenishing glycogen. So if you go exercising and say you stick to it for a week or something and you're being active and you're really burning down that glycogen, and you're also on a diet so you're not really eating excess calories, then your glycogen stores will be down pretty significantly. But as soon as you go back in the other direction, your body is going to say thank you and start replenishing that glycogen. And so it's really easy to put that weight back on again. And that's something that can be kind of discouraging if you're trying to be diligent and exercise and you see the weight loss, but then hey, it gets put right back on again. And at least part of the explanation for that is because your glycogen stores account for a lot more weight than a lot of people realize, and can both be burned away and put back on very quickly. Now, the third fate of carbohydrates, if they're not being metabolized right away as part of your baseline activity, and they're not being stored as glycogen, is that they can be stored as fat. And now, for some relative amounts here, in young, healthy people who exercise regularly, basically best case scenario, about 30% of the carbohydrates that you readily absorb are metabolized right away, are burned up, are used for fuel right away. Maybe about 10% are converted into glycogen, and overall about a third or so are converted into fat. Now again, this is best case scenario. So if you're like most Americans and you're at least overweight or maybe even obese, if you don't get much physical exercise, and if you rarely go on a fast, meaning where you have long periods of time where you're not eating, then there's a pretty good chance that you'll be storing even more than 30% of carbohydrates you readily absorb as fat. And the more carbohydrates you eat, and the more quickly that they're absorbed, the higher the percentage of those absorbed carbohydrates are going to get converted into fat. And just as an example, a 20-ounce soda has about 65 grams of sucrose, which is glucose and fructose. And incidentally, fructose is probably even worse than glucose in terms of being converted into fat, and that's a topic for another day. But if you have one 20-ounce soda every day for a year, that ends up being about 11 pounds of body fat that you have to do something about. Either you're putting on that weight, or you're having to eat less overall, or you're exercising more to do something about it. And not only is the fact that you put on body fat a significant problem when carbohydrates are quickly absorbed, but the way that your body both produces and stores the fat is actually a secret additional problem, because it raises your cholesterol levels. And there's, again, a lot of confusion out there about what your cholesterol levels really are, and it's actually not the same thing as the cholesterol that you eat in food. Like, for example, eggs and shellfish have a lot of dietary cholesterol, and we see that on nutrition labels as well, the amount of cholesterol that something has. When we're talking about cholesterol in your body, we're really talking about things that are called lipoprotein particles. Now, basically what this is these are the vehicles that fat gets packed into by the liver and sent out into circulation. So when your liver produces fat, it has to basically find a way to get them into the bloodstream, because fat is oily, it's not soluble in water, and your blood is basically water. So what it does is it sticks them into a little membrane layer, packs them right in there, and in the surface of that layer there are kind of islands of cholesterol, the cholesterol that people think of in diet. There is cholesterol in the membrane layer with proteins, and this gets all filled up with fat and then sent out into the bloodstream. And when it gets produced by the liver initially, it's something called a very low density lipoprotein, or VLDL particle. Now you might notice in there the LDL, because what happens when this VLDL particle, very low density lipoprotein, goes to the fat cells and drops off its fat into those fat cells for storage, what's left over is what's called a low density lipoprotein, or LDL particle. And this is probably what a lot of you have heard about as your bad cholesterol. This is something that you don't want to have a lot of in your bloodstream, because this LDL particle, we've seen across numerous studies that it is one very important risk factor for development of atherosclerosis, or plaque forming in the arteries, because this particle seems to be able to get underneath the lining of blood vessels, especially in your arteries, and cause buildup of plaque there, that over time can cause progressive narrowing and narrowing of the blood vessels. So one, it can just be harder for blood to get through, period, or also, probably even just as important or more important, it can contribute to clots forming there that suddenly cause complete blockage of the arteries. But you basically don't want atherosclerosis. It doesn't cause symptoms for a very long time, but when it does, it makes itself known in a big way, with heart attacks and strokes and all sorts of other complications, kidney disease, and it tends to snowball on itself in a really dangerous way that I'm sure some of you have firsthand experience with, and it's a tough situation to be in. So limiting the amount of LDL, or low density lipoprotein, that your body produces is one really important way to reduce your risk factor for atherosclerosis that then can lead to things like heart attack, stroke, kidney disease, and all sorts of other stuff. So this is another reason why lowering the rate at which you absorb carbohydrates has a really meaningful effect on your health. And so in a nutshell, you could say, with at least respect to this first point here, that the faster you absorb carbohydrates, the more of that total carbohydrate load will be converted into fat, and in the process raise your blood cholesterol levels. So you both gain weight in terms of extra body fat and have worse cholesterol levels that can lead to all sorts of complications like heart attacks and strokes. The second reason why absorbing carbohydrates more slowly is a good thing is because it improves your satiety, or reduces your appetite over time. And it kind of makes sense. You can basically think of it like, imagine you just had a slow, steady release of energy into your bloodstream over time with a slow absorption of carbohydrates. So your body has the resources it needs. It's not being flooded with a huge dump of them to figure out what the heck do I have to do with them. I can only use so many, so I'm just going to put the rest where I can. It's just a slow release over time, and so more of that can be used just for immediate energy needs. You don't need to pack it all away, because you're just kind of getting what you need as you need it. And so the reason why improving your satiety and reducing your hunger and appetite over time is important is because you can go longer times between meals, and when you do eat, you might not be as hungry, meaning that you are less likely to overload yourself and kind of misjudge, well, how much do I really need to eat? And so if you're eating foods that improve your satiety more, then it's a lot easier to eat fewer total calories, which ultimately is really the key to avoiding weight gain, is the total calories absorbed. But the rate at which you absorb carbohydrates is an essential piece of that, both because of what we talked about with how it works to increase body fat and cholesterol levels, but also just reducing your total appetite and the likelihood that you're going to just have to wolf down something when it comes time for the next meal, which will come sooner if you're hungry. And so the third thing that is probably the most well-known and obvious one is that when you quickly absorb carbohydrates, it spikes your blood sugar levels, and a lot of people know that this is a risk for diabetes. As you may know, diabetes, or really what I'm talking about here is type 2 diabetes, is characterized by high fasting or just baseline blood sugar levels, as well as resistance to the effects of insulin. Now, what normally happens is that when you absorb carbohydrates, really doesn't matter, how much you're absorbing, there are cells in your pancreas that detect that elevation in your blood glucose, and in response, they release insulin into circulation. Now, insulin acts on cells, mostly fat and muscle cells, to tell them to take in more blood glucose. Say, my blood sugar is up, we got to do something with it, let's take it into the cells. The more sugar that you have in circulation, the more glucose that those cells in the pancreas sees, the more insulin it's going to produce, because it says, hey, we have a ton of sugar around, we really need to do something about it. So you can get a big release of insulin if you suddenly have a lot of blood sugar, such in the case where you're eating carbohydrates that are very readily absorbed and spike your blood sugar level. And so the important thing here is that your body has mechanisms for what we call tolerance, which means basically reducing the effect of something over time if it's too much. So the way I think about it is that in the case of diabetes, in response to high blood sugar levels, you release all this insulin that acts on the cells that take up all this glucose, and they might not really need that much. They'll take it in, they'll try to store all the glycogen they can, they'll convert what they can into fat, but it's sort of like saying, well, I got all this, thank you for all this, but it's more than I needed. I feel like we overdid it this time. And so there are mechanisms in place with high spikes in insulin to reduce the sensitivity of the cells it acts on to future release of insulin. So if you keep spiking your blood sugar and keep causing big releases of insulin, over time, that will reduce the sensitivity of cells to that insulin effect. And so you can have another big spike in blood sugar, and you'll release a lot of insulin, but the cells just won't take up as much because they say, hey, I've seen this before, I don't need that much, thanks. Now, the reason why this is so important is because one of the effects of insulin is to reduce the amount of glucose that your liver produces and puts out into circulation. Now, your liver normally is really essential for maintaining your blood glucose levels. You always need some amount of blood glucose, especially to power the brain, which runs mostly on glucose. There are other scenarios where it can use other things, but it mostly runs on glucose. And so your liver's in charge of maintaining that level. But if your liver becomes less sensitive to the effects of insulin, then whatever insulin is around is not going to suppress the liver's production of glucose as much. And so the liver is going to spit out more glucose, and it's going to raise your blood sugar levels. And so this is thought to be one of the ways in which when you have type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, that you have high blood sugar levels all the time, high fasting blood sugar levels. Now, why is this a problem? It's because a few reasons, but one of the main ones is that this sugar in the blood glucose, it starts sticking to things, and it produces what are called advanced glycation end products. But basically what this is when sugar starts sticking to proteins and all sorts of other stuff, it can actually activate your immune system. Some of your immune cells have receptors for these things, and it's known that diabetes is a pro-inflammatory state. And we see this all the time in terms of how diabetes contributes to both inflammation inside of atherosclerotic plaques. So where I said the LDL cholesterol can get underneath the blood vessel walls and increase the amount of plaque that's present there, diabetes can facilitate that by making it easier for the plaque to build up, and also make the plaques more unstable, more inflammatory, more prone to forming blood clots. And diabetes just has so many complications that are, more than we can really list out here, but it also raises your risk of heart attacks, of strokes, of peripheral blood vessel disease. It causes kidney disease, it causes nerve damage, it causes eye damage in the form of retina disease in the back of the eye. And the list goes on. There's so many reasons why having diabetes is really serious, and if you're somebody that struggles with diabetes, Making meaningful changes in your diet, especially with respect to the types of carbohydrates you're eating, is one of the most important things that you are able to do yourself, in addition to whatever your doctor might be recommending to try to get things under control if it really is a serious issue. So what can you do? Hopefully I've made the point that eating carbohydrates that are rapidly absorbed is really detrimental for your health, both in terms of increasing body fat, raising your cholesterol levels, reducing your satiety or increasing how hungry you are and how many total calories you're likely to eat, as well as increasing your risk for type 2 diabetes. And there's so many complications that go with all these things. So what can you really do? I've said to try to eat carbohydrates that are more slowly absorbed. And so we'll talk about this in detail in the next video because I think it's something that's really important. But as some basic advice and the sorts of things that I tell patients when we only have a couple minutes to devote to this is that, first off, try to eat more vegetables, more fruit, more food that does not come in a package. The more that you can avoid refined processed foods, any foods that have added sugar, the better off that you're going to be. And when it comes to grains, things that are kind of normally in the carbohydrate family, just a couple of the ones that are particularly good, a couple of the ones that you can reach for if there's a question, are basically beans and legumes. So pinto beans, black beans, lentils, all sorts of things like that generally are slowly absorbed and are very healthy kinds of foods. For grains, oats are something that are fairly beneficial. They also have a high amount of soluble fiber that slows the absorption of the carbohydrates. Barley, and also just mixing your carbohydrates with something else, something that has protein or fat, basically to have a complex meal with lots of components. The worst thing that you can do is to eat something that just has readily available carbohydrates. The obvious one is sugar-sweetened beverages. So soda, sweetened tea, sports drinks. I mean, even juice is honestly not that good. It's probably a little bit better because it still has some of the fibrous material from the fruits themselves. But sweetened beverages really is one of the main culprits for getting carbohydrates into your system quickly and causing all these problems that I've just been talking about. So I hope that this video was helpful for you today. If you liked it, please leave a like. If you want to see more material like this in the future, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell notification so you can be notified if there's a new video out. I really appreciate your time, and I want to hear from you if there's ways that I can make this better, either improving the clarity of what I'm talking about, other topics you want to hear about, things you like that I did, things I should do better, things that were confusing, anything you think I should know about the quality of this and how I can do better in the future. So I appreciate your time. I hope that this helps you or somebody you know, somebody you love, and look out for more content soon. All right, take care, guys. Bye now.